Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about something that we've learned with the research, and some of it should be common sense, and it really should end a lot of the arguments that you see out there regarding exercise selection and hypertrophy being muscle gains. But most of the more recent meta analysis have kind of come to conclusions that it turns out single joint and multi joint exercises. Slang terms for those are often compound and isolation, but those are not really accurate words. But that's what a lot of bodybuilders call them. But single joint and multi joint exercises. An example of that would be bench press would be multi joint, and a fly or a tricep extension would be single joint, right? Moving multiple joints, a big movement versus one joint. What they're finding is that if the movements themselves are similar, the muscle stimulation is the same. In other words, a fly and a bench press do not build different amounts of pectoral, okay? Right, because the same joint is moved the same distance. Okay, that's what they're finding. Now, we generally agree that bigger exercises are better exercise economy because most of them, train multiple big muscles, right? They usually train multiple big muscles. Sometimes a smaller muscle is involved, such as a row there, a bicep is being worked on a row, right? It's not just all those muscles of the back. Now, in the case of the row, though, we could argue that it is not an amazing bicep stimulator. Some types of curls will stimulate the bicep more. And that's kind of where we go to with the research, but we don't say that it doesn't work it. All right, but if the movement itself is similar, there's no difference in localized hypertrophy. But keeping in mind, our sum total of our exercises are what determine muscle growth in a muscle. Again, you'll see a lot of people say, well, look, big muscles or big exercises because they work multiple muscles will cause more growth. Now, that part is true because multiple muscles are involved. But every muscle involved may not be getting maximal stimulation, but it's getting some. And it does add up, right? Over the course of different exercises being added together, well obviously, it all accumulates, okay? But they obviously work more muscles, so there's more growth. Now, people who argue, well, because we can use heavier weights, it's putting more tension on the muscle. Well, that's not always true because it's dispersed through multiple muscles and multiple joints. So that's not actually true in terms of the tension. So here's what they're finding, though. But other people will say, well, the single joint, because it isolates a muscle more, therefore you can concentrate on it more, that it builds more muscle. Well, that's not what the research is showing either. That's not true either. It's not true at all. So what you find, let's take an example, a fly and a bench press. If the fly moves your shoulder through the same range of motion as the bench press, the muscle stimulus is the same if they're taken to the same level of fatigue. In other words, if you do 3 sets of 10 with 1 rep left in the tank, like 1 rep from failure, you could maybe grind out 1 more, or you took them to failure. Right, the rate of perceived exertion is the same, and if you're touching your chest on the bench and your fly takes it about to the same range of motion, what they find is because the joint and the muscle are moving through the same range of motion with the same amount of net fatigue, right? So stimulus, tension, everything on it, volume is the same, growth is the same, no difference, right? Whether you're a novice, an advanced lifter, doesn't even matter. The growth stimulus seems to be the same when it's studied. If it's a different or a superior angular stimulus, it can be more. So example, the perfect example, you'll see me doing some dumbbell curls with a supine grip versus those neutral grip rows with a dumbbell. You look at those studies, what do we find? Well, because it's a slightly different angle, the row causes a little less muscle growth than the curl. Now, the back development can be maximal from that row. The lats, even mid traps, all that stuff, right? Those can receive very, very good maximal stimulation. The biceps don't grow quite as much, and we have hypertrophy studies comparing 6 sets of rows with a dumbbell versus 6 sets of curls with a dumbbell. in a week, right? We have studies on this. Guess what? The rows only caused about 60 to 70%. I think it was like 70% of the growth that the curls caused. If that's all that was done, was just rows or just curls. Okay, well that makes sense. But it's still causing bicep growth. So people say, well, the row's not working at all. Well, no, it caused about 70% of the growth. Now, when you start accumulating these over the week, obviously some exercises are going to work muscles more effectively than others. You just bridge the gap. But here's what you'll find. If you're doing rows, you're getting good bicep stimulus. You do add a curl in at the end, you get better bicep stimulus. It all accumulates. Because you still have moderate quality tension being applied from the rows. You can finish it with a curl, you're in a good shape. All right. Bench pressing tends to maximize pec development. That's not a question in the research. People who think the flat bench isn't one of the best pec exercises are probably not performing it correctly. Triceps, not so much. Same thing. Triceps get great growth from the bench press. It's just not in all three heads. It tends to be biased towards the lateral head. Extensions, like what I'm doing here with a skull crusher, tend to cause all three heads to grow, but it's biased towards the long head. Hypertrophy studies that have looked at that have found that to be the case. All three heads grow from either exercise, but the bias is there. When they combined it, when they did bench press and then skull crushers, like you did the big movement, then the small movement after. By the way, if you reverse those, it causes less growth in the studies. But you take that, and because it's working the muscle differently, there's a different stimulus. That's the only time it matters. So I just use these two arm exercises versus the fly. The fly is the same stimulus as the press. No difference. So there's no difference in growth. In these cases, some of the heads are being worked at more bias with the smaller exercise only because it works at different joint angles and positions than the big movement. Well, the same study that looked at the bench press and the skull crusher found that the triceps grew the most when you did out of all the different comparisons they did, bench only, skull crusher only, skull crusher first, then bench, then skull crusher. That latter one where they did the bench press followed by finishing up with sets of skull crushers after doing the sets of bench caused the most tricep growth because it worked all of the heads, right? You got all the combined growth from both exercises with the bias towards those two other heads. The net result, the whole muscle just got bigger and it produced the best muscle growth. So there's nothing inherently magical. In other words, if the muscle's being worked a specific way, it doesn't matter if it comes from a bigger or a smaller movement. Doesn't matter. But if you're trying to get a muscle as big as possible, hitting a couple different angles, if there's a different angle that can be hit like that, can create more muscle growth. So that's a case where that might occur, and it's a case you got to look at each muscle and movement involved. But because it's a bigger or a smaller movement on a compound versus isolating a muscle, that doesn't actually seem to affect muscle growth. It's irrelevant. What muscles care about is the tension placed upon them, the work demands they do, and the angles that they're hit at.